My mother-in-law looked me up and down in the marble foyer of the Ashbourne Country Club and said, "Natalie, sweetheart, next time try to dress like you married into this family on purpose." She said it softly enough to pretend it was advice, but loudly enough for the hostess, two club members, and my husband's younger sister to hear every word. I was wearing a navy wrap dress, simple pearl studs, and nude heels I had owned for 3 years. Vivian Whitmore was wearing winter white silk, a diamond tennis bracelet, and the satisfied expression of a woman who had spent her whole life confusing cruelty with taste. My husband Evan stood beside me, smiling at the floor like the marble pattern had suddenly become fascinating. That was his gift, disappearing without leaving the room. The hostess gave me a quick, sympathetic glance, then looked down at the reservation screen. Vivian leaned closer, touching my sleeve with 2 fingers like my dress might wrinkle her. "I'm only saying this because people notice things here," she whispered. "Ashbourne is not one of those little chain restaurants your family goes to. Members have standards." Her daughter Sienna laughed into her champagne. "Mom, stop. Natalie can't help being practical." Practical. That word followed me everywhere in their family. It meant I did not spend enough to impress them, did not flatter them fast enough, and did not understand that the Whitmores believed appearing wealthy was the same as being important. Before I continue, if someone has ever tried to make you feel small in a room you helped pay for, you will understand why I did not defend my dress that night. I was 30 years old, a financial compliance analyst for a healthcare investment firm in Atlanta, and my entire job was noticing what people tried to hide inside numbers. I reviewed expense trails, vendor payments, corporate card abuse, hospitality budgets, internal approvals, and the kind of minor irregularities that turn into lawsuits when arrogant people assume no one will read the second page. Vivian thought I was quiet because she intimidated me. Evan thought I stayed calm because I hated conflict. Neither of them understood that calm was how I did my best work. We were at Ashbourne for Vivian's pre-auction dinner, a private gathering before the club's annual Children's Hospital charity event. Vivian had been talking about it for weeks, calling it our family's most visible night of the season, as if visibility were a medical necessity. She had instructed me to keep my hair down, avoid office talk, and not mention that my parents owned a hardware store in Macon. "People can be judgmental," she had said over brunch, while charging mimosas to a membership account she claimed Evan's father had maintained for 20 years. That was the story everyone believed. The Whitmores were old Atlanta money, club donors, polished hosts, people whose last name opened doors. I had been married to Evan for 11 months, long enough to know the doors were real, but not long enough to know who had been paying to keep them unlocked. Vivian swept toward the dining room, and the hostess followed with menus. Evan finally touched my back. "Don't take it personally," he murmured. "Mom is just nervous tonight." I looked at him. He was handsome in the harmless way men are handsome when they have never had to be brave. "She called me cheap in front of strangers," he sighed, already tired of my accuracy. "She didn't use that word, as if cruelty only counted when it arrived in a dictionary-approved form. Besides," he added, "this dinner matters. Can we just get through it?" That was the entire Whitmore marriage manual, apparently. Get through it, smile through it, pay through it, and never ask why your dignity was always the bill. The private dining room overlooked the 18th green, with tall windows, brass sconces, and floral centerpieces that looked expensive because they were not trying too hard. Vivian sat at the head of the table before anyone could question it. Her husband Grant took the seat beside her, already checking the wine list like a man trying to outrun silence with Cabernet. Sienna slid into the chair across from me and placed her designer clutch on the table as if it needed its own spotlight. Evan sat between me and his father. The moment the server arrived, Vivian ordered 2 bottles of a Napa Reserve without looking at the price. "Put it on the family account," she said breezily. The server nodded, but I saw the smallest hesitation before he walked away. That hesitation caught my attention. Not because of the wine. Rich people over-ordering wine was not a mystery. But the phrase family account did something strange in my mind. 3 months earlier, my firm had signed a hospitality sponsorship with Ashbourne for client entertainment and healthcare donor events. I had reviewed the compliance side myself because the arrangement involved charitable dinners, board meetings, and strict limits on personal use. The account was under BCI Health Partners, my employer. I was one of 2 authorized approvers for the hospitality charges. The dependent access list was supposed to include approved executives only. Not Vivian. Not Grant. Not Sienna. Definitely not a family account. I told myself not to jump too quickly. Compliance work teaches you that suspicion is not proof. Still, as appetizers arrived, I watched the servers. Every time Vivian ordered something extra, the same phrase appeared. Family account. Extra oysters. Family account. Private decanter service. Family account. Sienna ordered a spa lunch package for the next morning and told the server, "Just add it to Whitmore." Grant asked whether his golf foursome from last week had been cleared. The server said, "Yes, sir, it went through yesterday." Evan shifted beside me, just slightly. I looked at him, but he would not meet my eyes. Vivian noticed me watching and smiled. "Natalie, darling, don't look so tense. Nobody is asking you to pay." Sienna laughed again. "Can you imagine? She'd probably ask for a receipt before dessert." Evan said, "Sienna." But he said it softly, the way people correct a dog they secretly find cute. Vivian lifted her glass. "Receipts are for people who worry." I looked at the wine in her hand, the club crest on the glass, the relaxed arrogance around that table. "Receipts are also for people who want to know who actually paid," I said. The room paused for half a second. Vivian's smile did not move, but her eyes sharpened. "How very professional of you." Dinner continued, but the air had changed. Vivian began performing harder, telling stories about old club dances, donor luncheons, and the summer Evan practically grew up on this golf course. Grant nodded at all the right places. Sienna took photos of her plate. Evan kept squeezing my knee under the table every time I asked a normal question. "Stop," he whispered once, when I asked how long their family account had been active. "You're embarrassing me." That was interesting. Not upsetting. Interesting. Because people only call questions embarrassing when the answers are dangerous. Near the end of dinner, Vivian waved over the club manager, a silver-haired man named Daniel Price. "Daniel, make sure tomorrow's auction table is properly set under Whitmore Family Foundation," she said, loudly enough for neighboring tables to hear. "We're expecting guests." Daniel's eyes moved briefly to me, then back to Vivian. "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore. I did want to confirm one billing detail before tomorrow." Vivian's smile thinned. "Not now, Daniel. We're entertaining family." He hesitated. "The office asked that any additional charges be verified by the authorized sponsor representative." Vivian laughed. "Grant will handle whatever signature you need." Daniel did not look at Grant. He looked at me. For the first time all night, Vivian seemed to notice where his attention had gone. "Why are you looking at her?" she asked. Daniel's expression remained perfectly polite. "Because Mrs. Brooks is the authorized approver on the active sponsorship account." Sienna lowered her fork. Grant stopped swirling his wine. Evan went completely still beside me. Vivian blinked once, slowly, as if Daniel had spoken in another language. That cannot be right. Daniel turned his tablet slightly, not enough for the whole room, just enough for our table to see. There it was. BCI Health Partners Hospitality Sponsorship. Primary Compliance Approver, Natalie Brooks. Authorized signature required for expanded personal charges. The silence at that table was better than any speech I could have given. Vivian stared at the tablet, then at me, and for the first time since I had met her, she looked less like a queen and more like someone who had just realized the castle had a landlord. Evan whispered, "Natalie, I can explain." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and understood that he had known. Maybe not everything, maybe not the full amount, but enough. Enough to let his mother insult my dress while using an account connected to my name. Enough to sit beside me while his family ordered wine, spa packages, golf charges, and charity status under a sponsorship I was legally responsible for reviewing. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mrs. Brooks, I apologize for raising this during dinner, but the account has exceeded normal hospitality thresholds, and we need confirmation before tomorrow's auction." Vivian's voice came out sharp. "Daniel, this is inappropriate." He looked at her with the weary patience of a man who had handled rich tantrums for 20 years. "So is unsupported personal billing on a restricted sponsorship account." "Mrs. Whitmore," Sienna whispered. "Oh my God." Grant put down his wine glass. Evan reached for my hand under the table. I moved my hand before he touched me. Vivian recovered faster than I expected. "Natalie," she said, her voice suddenly warm, almost motherly. "This is clearly an administrative mix-up. We'll discuss it privately after dinner." Privately. That word always came out when public lies needed a dark room to survive. I looked at Daniel. "Please send me the full charge history for the past 90 days. Vivian's mouth fell open. Evan whispered my name like a warning. I ignored him. "Include itemized dining, spa, golf, wine cellar, guest passes, auction prep, and any dependent user activity." Daniel nodded. "I can have that to you within the hour." I stood, placing my napkin beside a plate of food I no longer wanted. Vivian hissed, "Sit down. You are making a scene." I looked at her winter white silk, her diamond bracelet, the club members pretending not to listen, and the husband who had let me walk blind into a room where his family was spending through my authority. "No, Vivian," I said calmly. "You made the charges. I'm just asking for the receipts." Then my phone buzzed. An email from Ashbourne Country Club appeared on the screen with the subject line, "Urgent review, Whitmore charges pending." I opened it and saw the preliminary total at the top, $58,640. Under it, one line item was highlighted in red. "Unauthorized wine cellar transfer scheduled for auction night." I read the red line twice before I looked up. "Unauthorized wine cellar transfer scheduled for auction night." It sounded almost elegant, the way rich people made theft wear a tuxedo. Vivian was staring at my phone like she could make the email disappear if she looked offended enough. Evan leaned closer and whispered, Natalie, not here. That was becoming his favorite sentence, and each time he said it, I heard what he really meant. Not where they can hear, not where you have witnesses, not where my family loses control of the story. I turned the screen toward him just enough for him to see the amount. His face changed before he could stop it. Not surprise, fear. Daniel Price remained beside the table, still holding his tablet, patient and professional. Mrs. Brooks, he said, the wine cellar transfer is tied to tomorrow's live auction display. It appears to have been requested under the Whitmore Family Foundation table, but the billing was routed through the BCI sponsorship account. Vivian's voice sharpened. Daniel, you are discussing internal club operations in front of guests. He looked at her. I am discussing a restricted account with the person authorized to approve it. The correction was quiet, but it struck the table like a dropped knife. For the first time that evening, Vivian did not know which mask to put on. Grant finally spoke. It's wine, Daniel. Let's not act like we robbed a bank. That told me more than any denial would have. People who are innocent usually ask what happened. People who are guilty start arguing about whether it matters. I sat back down, not because Vivian told me to, but because I wanted every word from that point forward to happen with me calm, seated, and impossible to paint as hysterical. How much is the wine transfer? I asked. Daniel glanced at the tablet. The pending transfer is listed at $18,900. Sienna made a small choking sound. Evan rubbed both hands over his face. Vivian said, It was for charity. I looked at her. Then why was it billed to my company's hospitality account instead of your foundation? The word foundation made Grant's jaw tighten. Vivian reached for her water glass and missed it by half an inch. Sienna looked from her mother to her father like she was watching subtitles appear on a family movie she thought she understood. Evan said, Nat, the foundation is complicated. I turned to him. How complicated is it? He did not answer. Daniel did. The club has not received a current payment from the Whitmore Family Foundation for this year's auction pledge. That is why the office flagged the charge. Vivian stood so fast her chair legs scraped against the floor. That is enough, Daniel. We will speak with the board tomorrow. Daniel nodded once. Of course. Until then, no additional charges can be processed without Mrs. Brooks's written approval. I almost smiled at that. Written approval. Two words Vivian clearly hated because they took power away from tone, pressure, and family theater. She looked down at me, and the warm mother-in-law act was gone. Natalie, I need you to remember you are a guest in this family. I folded my napkin slowly and placed it beside the plate. No, Vivian. I am your son's wife, and apparently, I am also the compliance approver on the account your family has been using like a private wallet. A few heads turned from the next table. Vivian noticed, and her face softened instantly into public pain. I cannot believe you would humiliate us at our own club. I didn't order the wine, I said. I opened the email. Evan grabbed my elbow under the table. Not hard, but urgent. Can we step outside? I looked at his hand until he released me. Yes, I said. We can. Vivian looked relieved, too quickly. She thought Evan was going to manage me. Sterile, she thought, once I was away from Daniel, away from the tablet, away from the eyes of people whose opinions she valued more than truth, I would become the woman who tried to keep peace at brunch. I stood, thanked Daniel, and walked toward the terrace doors with Evan following behind me. The night air was cool, and the golf course beyond the patio was dark, except for small path lights that made everything look expensive and empty. The second the door closed, Evan started crimed. My mother went too far tonight. I get that crimed, but you cannot blow this up at the club. I stared at him. Your mother called me cheap while charging personal expenses to an account I'm responsible for monitoring. She didn't know it was that serious. Did you? He looked away. There it was again. The answer he kept giving without words. I stepped closer. Did you give her access to the sponsorship account? Evan exhaled like I was exhausting him. I forwarded one approval link months ago because Dad's card was having issues with a dinner reservation. It was supposed to be temporary. Temporary access does not create 90 days of charges. Mom must have kept using it. And you knew. He finally looked at me. I knew some things went through. I didn't know the total. That was the first honest sentence he had said all night, and it was not enough to save him. You let me sit at that table while your sister mocked me for asking for receipts. Evan's shoulders dropped. I was trying to avoid a fight. No, I said. You were trying to avoid choosing. His face tightened. That's not fair. I laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because fairness sounded ridiculous coming from a man who had watched his mother measure my worth by my dress while spending through my professional liability. You chose every time you stayed silent. He lowered his voice. Natalie, you don't understand how my family works. I'm starting to. He looked toward the dining room, where Vivian was probably already rebuilding the story. Ashbourne is everything to my mother. If this gets out, she loses the committee, the auction, maybe the membership. I waited. He seemed to think that was an argument. And if I approve charges I know are personal, I asked, I could lose my job, my license, pathway, my reputation. But that did not bother you when your family was ordering wine. Evan flinched. I thought we could fix it later. With whose money? He did not answer. I nodded. That's what I thought. My phone buzzed again. Daniel had sent the preliminary charge history. I opened the file and scrolled. The total was exactly what the email said. $58,640. Spa lunches, golf guest fees, private dining, wine cellar holds, guest passes, floral charges for Vivian's committee luncheon, Sienna's birthday brunch, Grant's cigar night, and beside each charge, the same account routing. BCI, hospitality, sponsorship, dependent user, Whitmore. I forwarded the file to my work compliance inbox and copied my personal email. Evan saw the movement and panicked. Natalie, don't send that yet. I looked at him. It's already sent. The terrace door opened behind us. Vivian stepped out, wrapped in her white silk shawl like a wronged queen in a community theater production. Evan, go inside, she said. He hesitated. Mom, go inside. And he did. That was when I knew my marriage was in more trouble than the account. Vivian watched him leave, then turned to me with a smile so cold it almost looked calm. You are new to this world, so I will explain something. Families like ours handle problems privately. I looked through the glass of the dining room, at Grant pretending to check his phone, at Sienna whispering fiercely to Evan. Families like yours seem to create problems publicly and hide the invoices privately. Her smile vanished. Do not get clever with me. Then don't give me so much material. For a moment, I saw the real Vivian Whitmore. Not polished, not graceful, hungry, terrified. Photographers. Angry that the wrong person had been handed a number she could not charm. You think because your name is on some corporate paperwork, you can embarrass us? She said. Let me be very clear. Without this family, you are a small-town girl with a spreadsheet job and a clearance rack dress. Do not confuse access with status. I held her gaze. That's funny. I was about to say the same thing to you. She stepped closer. Tomorrow night, you will approve the auction charges. You will smile. You will sit where I place you, and you will not mention this again. My phone was still in my hand. I did not record her. I did not need to. Daniel Price was standing just inside the terrace door, frozen with a folder against his chest, having heard every word. Vivian saw my eyes move and turned slowly. Daniel's face was carefully blank, but the damage was done. He cleared his throat. Mrs. Brooks, I have the printed charge history you requested. Vivian's skin went pale beneath her makeup. I took the folder from him. Thank you, Daniel. Inside the folder, clipped to the front page, was a yellow note from the club's billing office. Sponsorship account now locked pending written compliance review. No dependent charges authorized. I read it, closed the folder, and looked back at Vivian. For once, she had no instruction ready. No insult sharp enough. No family pressure strong enough to unlock an account she had never owned. The club lights reflected in the terrace glass behind her, and for the first time, I saw Ashbourne for what it really was to the Whitmores. Not a home, not a legacy, but a stage they could no longer afford without my signature. By the time we walked back into the dining room, Vivian had repaired her face. That was the thing about women like her. Panic only lasted until there was an audience. Then it became posture. She moved to the head of the table, lifted her glass, and smiled at the neighboring members as if Daniel had not just locked an account she had been treating like inherited wealth. Grant stood when she sat, too late to look chivalrous and too nervous to look innocent. Sienna was whispering into her phone, probably warning friends that tomorrow's auction might not be as Instagrammable as promised. Evan looked at me once, then looked away. He knew the folder in my hand was heavier than paper. Vivian tapped her knife against her glass. Everyone, she said brightly, even though everyone did not include enough people to justify a speech. I want to thank you for joining us tonight before tomorrow's charity auction. The Whitmore family has always believed in giving back. I looked at Daniel across the room. He was speaking quietly to the hostess, but his eyes flicked toward Vivian when she said, giving back. The phrase sounded different now. Not noble, borrowed. Vivian continued, and I am so grateful to have my son and his wife here with us. She looked at me with the kind of smile that warned me not to breathe wrong. Family unity matters, especially when small misunderstandings arise. Small misunderstandings. There it was again. The bleach they poured over every stain. I did not interrupt her. I opened the folder on my lap and scanned the first page while she spoke. Spa lunch, $120. Golf foursome, $2,800. Private terrace dinner, $4,650. Wine cellar hold, $18,900. Committee floral refresh, $3,400. Guest passes, $2,100. Sienna's birthday brunch, $5,760. Vivian's donor welcome gifts, $6,300. Each charge had been routed through the BCI sponsorship using dependent access Evan had forwarded months earlier. The Whitmores had not just crossed a line. They had moved into the space beyond it, decorated it, and called it family tradition. Dinner ended with the slow, brittle politeness of people leaving a room full of broken glass. Vivian hugged guests near the doorway, laughing too loudly, promising to see them at the auction tomorrow. When she hugged one older woman in emerald silk, I heard her say, "The hospital children are what matter, not little administrative hiccups." The woman nodded, but her eyes slid toward the folder under my arm. People at country clubs understand money the way fishermen understand weather. They can smell a storm before the first drop falls. Vivian thought she had contained the damage. She had only made it more interesting. In the parking circle, Evan finally tried to take my hand. I stepped back. He looked wounded, which annoyed me more than if he had looked angry. "Natalie, can we go home and talk?" "Which home?" I asked. He blinked. "What? The condo we pay for, or your parents' house where your mother seems to make our financial decisions?" His face tightened. "That's not fair." I opened my car door. "You knew enough to warn me not to send the records. You knew enough to panic when Daniel mentioned the account. So tonight, I'm going home alone." Vivian, who was waiting near the valet stand, turned at the word alone. "Don't be dramatic," she said. "Husbands and wives do not leave separately over dinner tension." I looked at her. "They do when the husband helped create the tension and the wife needs to preserve evidence." Grant muttered. "For God's sake." Sienna said, "This is so embarrassing." I looked at her designer clutch, the one she had photographed beside every course. "Then you should be relieved your brunch account is logged." Her mouth fell open. Vivian stepped forward. "You will not speak to my daughter that way. Your daughter spent through my company's account. She is young. She is 26. She didn't understand. She understood enough to say, 'Put it on Whitmore.'" Vivian's face went hard, but Evan stepped between us. "Stop! Everyone just stop!" I almost felt sorry for him then. Not because he was innocent, but because he had spent his whole life mistaking delay for peace. Now every postponed truth had arrived at the valet stand wearing evening clothes. I drove home without music. The city lights blurred across the windshield, and for the first time since dinner, I let myself feel the humiliation beneath the numbers. Vivian's comments about my dress. Sienna laughing at receipts. Grant dismissing an $18,900 wine transfer like it was a misplaced umbrella. Evan touching my elbow, whispering, "Not here," as if the location was the problem and not the lie. I had married into a family that called me cheap while using my name to keep their expensive life breathing. The cruelty was not just that they spent the money. It was that they needed me to feel beneath them while they did it. At home, I changed out of the navy dress and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open. I forwarded Daniel's full charge packet to my firm's internal compliance archive with a neutral subject line: Ashbourne sponsorship account, potential personal use review. Then I wrote a clean timeline. No insults, no guesses. Date access was forwarded. Date first personal charge appeared. Date-dependent charges increased. Date unauthorized wine cellar transfer was scheduled. Date club manager confirmed account lock. I attached screenshots, PDFs, and the yellow billing note. My hands did not shake until after I hit save. Then I sat back and stared at the screen, suddenly aware that by protecting myself, I might have ended my marriage. At 12:17 a.m., Evan texted, "Mom is devastated. Please don't send anything else tonight." I waited to feel sadness. It came, but not alone. Photographers brought clarity with it. I typed back, "Your mother is not the account holder." Then I put the phone on silent. 5 minutes later, Vivian called, then Grant, then Sienna, then Evan again. I watched the screen light up over and over, each name appearing like a door I no longer had to open. At 12:41, a voicemail transcription from Vivian appeared. "You do not understand the damage you are causing. The board will ask questions. People will think we are frauds." I read the last sentence twice. People will think we are frauds. Even in panic, she was more worried about being seen than being wrong. The next morning, I woke to an email from my firm's chief compliance officer, Marisol Grant. It was short. "Natalie, thank you for flagging. Do not approve additional activity. We are initiating a formal review. Please preserve communications and avoid direct discussion with non-authorized users." I read it 3 times, then showered, dressed in a black sheath dress and a blazer, and drove to my office instead of answering Evan's calls. By 10, Marisol had me in a conference room with legal counsel, the sponsorship agreement, and the Ashbourne billing packet spread across the table. No one gasped. No one called it family drama. They called it what it was: misuse of a restricted corporate hospitality account. Marisol was a calm woman in her 50s with silver hair and a voice that made excuses sound childish. "Natalie," she said, "you did the right thing rooting this immediately. The concern is not only the amount, it is the pattern, the dependent access, and the scheduled transfer for a charitable auction. If BCI funds were used to support a private family's donor status, we have exposure." Legal counsel nodded. "We will notify Ashbourne that all charges require direct verification from BCI compliance. Dependent access is revoked. We will also request records of who used the account and when." I asked the question I did not want to ask. "What about Evan?" He forwarded the original approval link. Marisol's face softened slightly. "Then Evan is part of the record." That sentence stayed with me all afternoon. Evan is part of the record. Not my husband. Not Vivian's son. Not the man who once held my hand in a courthouse hallway and promised we were a team. Part of the record. It sounded cold, but there was mercy in it. Records did not care who cried louder. They did not adjust themselves because a mother-in-law felt embarrassed. They did not ask me to be gracious while someone else spent through my name. They simply held the shape of what happened. At 4:30, Daniel Price called my office line. His voice was polite but strained. "Mrs. Brooks? I wanted you to know Mrs. Whitmore has requested a private meeting with the auction committee tonight before the event. She says she intends to clarify the misunderstanding." I looked at Marisol, who was sitting across from me, reviewing the sponsorship agreement. "Did she mention the locked account?" I asked. Daniel paused. "She said the lock was temporary and that you would personally approve the release before the auction." I almost laughed. Vivian had lost the account, but not the instinct. When denied access, she simply invented my consent. Marisol reached for a notepad and wrote one sentence, then slid it across the table. Attend, say little, let them make representations. I nodded. Into the phone, I said, Daniel, please inform the committee I will attend as BCI's compliance representative. There was a silence on the line. Then Daniel said, Understood. After we hung up, Marisol closed the folder. Natalie, tonight is not about your marriage or your mother-in-law's feelings. It is about whether a restricted sponsorship was misused in connection with a charity event. Let them talk. People who rely on image usually over-explain when the image cracks. At 6:15 p.m., I arrived back at Ashbourne. The club looked transformed for auction night. Purple uplighting, white linens, champagne trays, framed photos of hospital children near the entrance, and a silent auction table arranged with polished generosity. Vivian stood near the ballroom doors in emerald silk, laughing with two committee members like she had never lost sleep in her life. Then she saw me. Her smile held, but her eyes went flat. Evan stood beside her, pale and stiff in a charcoal suit. He looked at my blazer, then at the BCI folder in my hand. Natalie, he said quietly, what are you doing here? I looked past him to the committee room, where Daniel was already opening the door. My job, I said. Vivian's hand closed around Evan's arm. She is not coming into that meeting. Daniel stepped forward before I could answer. Mrs. Whitmore, Mrs. Brooks, is the authorized compliance representative for the active sponsorship account. Vivian whispered, This is a family matter. I looked at the ballroom, at the auction banners, at the donor table under her name, at the wine display that had almost been transferred through my account. No, I said. It stopped being a family matter when you put it on a corporate bill. Then the committee chair called the meeting to order, and Vivian walked in first, still trying to look like the woman who owned the room. She had no idea that every invoice she had hidden behind charm was already printed in the folder I carried behind her. The committee room at Ashbourne was smaller than the ballroom, but designed to feel more important. Dark wood table, framed golf photographs, leather chairs, brass lamps, and a silver coffee service nobody touched. Vivian chose the chair closest to the head of the table before anyone invited her to sit. That was her habit: claim the center early, then act offended if someone noticed. Evan sat beside her, Grant on the other side, and Sienna slipped in behind them with her phone clutched in both hands. I sat across from Vivian with the BCI folder closed in front of me. Marisol had told me to say little. It turned out that was easy. Vivian had always been willing to fill silence with rope. The committee chair, a retired judge named Caroline Hensley, opened the meeting with a calm nod. Mrs. Whitmore, you requested time before tonight's auction to clarify an account issue. Vivian smiled gratefully, as if the judge had offered her tea instead of a chance to explain herself. Yes, Caroline, thank you. This has been terribly embarrassing, but I want everyone to understand this is a private family misunderstanding that was unfortunately escalated by my daughter-in-law. She looked at me with soft disappointment, the expression she used when she wanted strangers to believe she had been wounded by someone unreasonable. Natalie is new to our family and new to Ashbourne. She saw some club charges routed through a sponsorship account and panicked. Judge Hensley looked at me briefly, then back to Vivian. Panicked, Vivian nodded. She works in compliance, so naturally she sees problems everywhere. But the Whitmore family has supported this club and this charity event for years. The charges were for donor hospitality, auction presentation, and family-hosted functions that benefit the club's image. I watched Daniel Price stand near the wall, his face carefully neutral. Vivian continued, gaining confidence because no one had interrupted her yet. The wine cellar display, for example, was meant to elevate tonight's live auction. It would have reflected beautifully on the hospital. Frankly, it is hurtful that anyone would imply we were misusing funds. There it was, elevate, reflect beautifully. Hurtful. Vivian could turn an invoice into a charity sermon in under 30 seconds. Caroline folded her hands. Mrs. Brooks, would you like to respond? I opened the folder and slid one page across the table. BCI Health Partners is the active hospitality sponsor. The account has restricted use terms: personal family charges, private spa packages, golf guest fees, birthday brunches, and wine transfers under another family's donor name are not permitted without direct corporate approval. I did not approve them. I did not add adjectives. I did not say theft. I did not say fraud. The room did not need seasoning. The numbers had flavor enough. Vivian laughed softly. That sounds very serious when she says it that way. Photographers. Caroline picked up the page and read. The laugh thinned in the air. One committee member, a man named Arthur Bell, leaned closer. This says Sienna's birthday brunch was charged to BCI Hospitality. Sienna flushed. It was at the club. Arthur looked at her. That was not the question. Grant cleared his throat. We intended to reimburse any personal items once accounting caught up. I turned a second page toward Caroline. There are no reimbursement records in the packet Daniel provided. There is, however, a scheduled $18,900 wine cellar transfer listed under the Whitmore Family Foundation table, routed to BCI. Vivian's hand tightened around the arm of her chair. So Caroline looked at Daniel. Mr. Price, was the foundation current on its pledge? Daniel's jaw shifted. No, Judge Hensley. The pledge was outstanding. The room became very still. Vivian's face changed only slightly, but I saw it. The panic under the polish. Caroline looked back at Vivian. So, a wine transfer for a charity display under your family foundation was scheduled to bill through a corporate sponsor controlled by your daughter-in-law's employer. Vivian's voice sharpened. Controlled is a very loaded word, Caroline said. It is also the question. For a moment, Vivian looked toward Evan, as if expecting him to step in and smooth the road beneath her feet. Evan did speak, but not the way she wanted. I forwarded the original link, he said quietly. Photographers, Vivian turned to him. Evan. He kept his eyes on the table. Months ago, Mom said Dad's card had a temporary issue and she needed to reserve a private dining room. I thought it was a one-time thing, Grant muttered. You didn't need to say that. Evan looked up then, and something in his face had finally cracked past repair. Apparently I did. I felt no victory. That surprised me. I had imagined that hearing Evan tell the truth would feel like justice. Instead, it felt like watching a house I once lived in admit the foundation was rotten. Vivian sat straighter. My son was trying to help his family. That is not a crime, I said. The issue is not that he helped. The issue is that dependent access was reused for 90 days after the original purpose, including charges that were neither corporate hospitality nor approved charity expenses. Caroline nodded once. That is the issue as I understand it. Vivian's eyes flicked to the committee members. She was losing the room, and nothing made her more dangerous than losing the room. Natalie, she said softly, switching tactics. Do you really want to destroy your husband's family over a billing confusion? I looked at her, and for a second, the whole night narrowed to that sentence. Destroy your husband's family. Not protect your job. Not stop unauthorized charges. Not tell the truth. Destroy. That was how people like Vivian trained others to carry their consequences. They handed you the match, stood beside the fire they started, and cried arson when you refused to burn with them. No, I said. I want my name removed from your lifestyle. Daniel looked down at his tablet, but I saw the corner of his mouth tighten. Caroline did not smile. She simply wrote something on her notepad. Arthur Bell tapped the charge sheet. There is also a note here about guest passes. Daniel answered before Vivian could. Yes, 12 guest passes were issued under sponsorship hospitality for individuals listed as Whitmore guests. BC. I did not submit the names. Caroline asked. Who submitted them? Daniel hesitated. The request came from Mrs. Whitmore's email. Vivian's voice went cold. I am on the auction committee. Caroline looked at her. Not on the corporate sponsor authorization list. The correction was surgical. Vivian fell silent. Then Sienna made the mistake of trying to help. This is ridiculous, she said, standing halfway from her chair. Everyone here uses accounts. Everyone here knows families share things. Natalie is acting like we stole from children. The moment she said children, the room changed. Because the auction outside was for a children's hospital. Because the photos were already hanging in the ballroom. Because the wine transfer Vivian wanted to use for status had been attached to a charity event, and Sienna had just reminded everyone what the money was supposed to represent. Caroline's eyes hardened. Miss Whitmore, sit down. Sienna sat. Vivian whispered, Caroline, please. We have known each other for years. Caroline closed the folder in front of her. Yes, Vivian. That is why I am disappointed. Not angry, disappointed. Vivian flinched as if the word had physically touched her. Caroline continued. Until this is reviewed by the club board and BCI, the Whitmore Family Foundation table will not be announced as a major donor tonight. The wine display will be removed from live auction presentation. Your committee privileges are suspended pending review. Daniel, please ensure no additional charges route through the BCI account without written confirmation from Mrs. Brooks and her corporate compliance office. Vivian's face drained of color. You cannot suspend me on auction night. Caroline stood. I just did. Grant pushed back his chair. This is outrageous, Arthur said. No, Grant. Outrageous is billing your family brunches to a healthcare sponsor. Evan put his head in his hands. Sienna started crying, but quietly this time, without confidence that anyone would reward it. Vivian looked at me then with a hatred so naked, it almost felt honest. I hope you are proud of yourself, she said. I picked up my folder. I am relieved, I said. There's a difference. When the committee room doors opened, the auction noise rolled in, glasses clinking, music playing, donors laughing under purple lights. The world outside had no idea Vivian Whitmore had just lost the title she had dressed for. Daniel walked ahead to remove the wine display. Caroline spoke with 2 board members near the entrance. I stepped into the hallway, and Evan followed me. Natalie, he said, voice breaking. I'm sorry. I wanted those words to mean more. Once, they would have. But apology after exposure is not the same as honesty before harm. I looked at him, my husband of 11 months, and said, I know. Then I walked into the ballroom, carrying the folder that had done what my patience never could. The ballroom had been arranged to make generosity look effortless. Purple lights washed the white walls. Silver auction paddles sat beside folded programs. Photographs of children from the hospital lined the entrance, each one framed in gold and placed beside arrangements Vivian had probably tried to charge through the sponsorship account. A jazz trio played near the windows. Servers moved through the crowd with champagne trays, and every donor in the room smiled like money was clean, as long as it wore a tuxedo. I stood near the side wall with the BCI folder under my arm and watched Daniel quietly remove the wine display card from the live auction table. It had said, "Presented by the Whitmore Family Foundation." Within seconds, that lie disappeared into his leather portfolio. Vivian saw it happen from across the ballroom. She did not react at first. Effortless, frozen in its auction night smile. But her fingers tightened around her clutch until the knuckles turned white. Grant leaned toward her, whispering fast. Sienna stood behind them with red eyes and a trembling lower lip, still hoping someone would mistake exposure for cruelty. Evan stayed near the hallway, looking like a man who wanted to stand beside me, but did not know how to cross the floor without dragging his mother's shadow behind him. I did not wait for him. There are moments when a person's hesitation tells you more than any apology. Evan had spent 11 months loving me in private and managing me in public. Tonight, public finally mattered. The auction began at 7. Caroline Hensley stepped onto the small stage, elegant in a black evening suit, and welcomed everyone on behalf of the hospital committee. She thanked the donors, the medical staff, the sponsors, and the club. Then came the donor acknowledgments: the Ashford family, the Bell Trust, the Langley Pediatric Fund, BCI Health Partners. When she said my company's name, she looked briefly toward me. Photographers. No drama. No explanation. Just one clean nod. Vivian waited for the Whitmore Family Foundation to be announced next. I saw her lift her chin, ready to receive the room's recognition like communion. The Caroline moved on to the next sponsor. It was such a small omission. No accusation, no public shaming, no ugly spectacle. Just the absence of a name Vivian had built an identity around. That made it worse for her. She could not argue with silence without making everyone ask what had been removed. Her smile faltered for half a second. Grant muttered something under his breath. Sienna whispered, "Mom, why didn't she say us?" Vivian did not answer. Across the room, 2 committee women looked at each other, then looked away. Country clubs do not need announcements to spread news. A missing acknowledgement can travel faster than a scandal if the right people notice. The first few auction items went smoothly. A weekend at a lake house, a private chef dinner, a signed Braves jersey. Then Caroline reached the wine lot. I watched Daniel step up beside her and hand her the revised card. Caroline glanced at it, nodded, and read. A curated Napa Reserve package, generously redirected to tonight's auction by Ashbourne's Cellar Committee. Redirected. A perfect word. Clean, polite, and devastating to anyone who knew what it replaced. Vivian's face turned the color of the pearls at her throat. The wine still raised money for the hospital. The children still benefited. The only thing removed was the Whitmore name, from a gift they had tried to fund with someone else's account. Vivian could have stayed quiet. She could have survived the night with dignity, damaged but not destroyed. Instead, she walked toward me during the bidding break, with Grant and Sienna behind her like a small, angry parade. Evan followed at a distance, already too late. "You are enjoying this," Vivian said, her voice low. "You came here to watch me be humiliated." I looked past her to the hospital photos near the entrance. "No, Vivian. I came here to make sure my company was not used to buy your applause." Grant scoffed. "It was a billing issue." "Then why was your foundation pledge unpaid?" I asked. His face hardened. "You don't know anything about our finances." "I know enough to read an invoice." Sienna stepped forward. "You are so obsessed with receipts. This is why Mom said you never fit here." I looked at her calmly. "Sienna, your birthday brunch was charged to a healthcare sponsorship." Her cheeks flushed. "I didn't know." "Then now you do." Vivian's eyes flashed. "Do not speak to her like she is one of your employees." "I'm speaking to her like an adult who used an account she did not own." Vivian inhaled sharply, but before she could answer, Daniel appeared beside us. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he said. "Judge Hensley has asked that committee matters remain away from the donor floor." Vivian turned on him. "Daniel, I have been a member here for 15 years. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am. And tonight, I am asking you not to create a scene at a children's hospital fundraiser." That sentence reached farther than he intended. A few nearby guests turned. Vivian heard the shift immediately. Her public mask slammed back into place, but it was crooked now. "Of course," she said, smiling too brightly. "We would never do that." She touched my arm as if we were close. Natalie and I were simply having a family conversation. I stepped back before her fingers settled. No, we weren't. The simplicity of it stopped her. She had expected me to soften the room for her. I did not. Vivian's hand hung in the air for 1 second too long, then dropped. Evan finally reached us. "Mom, stop." Everyone looked at him. Vivian looked most surprised of all. "Excuse me?" His voice was unsteady, but it did not disappear. "You need to stop. Natalie didn't create this. We did." Grant stared at him. Sienna whispered, "Evan." He swallowed. I forwarded the link. Mom kept using it. Dad knew charges were going through somewhere else. We all knew enough to ask fewer questions. For 1 second, I felt the floor shift under me. Not because the truth was new, but because Evan had finally put himself inside it. Vivian looked at him like he had betrayed blood itself. But really, he had only stopped translating theft into loyalty. Grant grabbed Evan's arm. "You don't talk about family business in public." Evan pulled away. "That's exactly how we got here." Vivian's lips trembled, but rage beat tears to the surface. "After everything this family gave you," she whispered to him. Evan looked at her, and for the first time all night, I saw the child in him. The boy raised to believe love was access, silence was duty, and image was survival. "Mom," he said quietly, "you used my wife." Vivian's face changed. Not guilt, offense. As if being named accurately was the cruelest thing anyone had done to her. Caroline Hensley approached before Vivian could answer. "Is there a problem?" Vivian smiled. "No problem at all. Caroline looked at Evan, then at me, then at Daniel. Good. Because the board has decided to suspend further Whitmore committee participation tonight. Daniel will escort you to the private lounge if you need time to collect yourselves. Sienna gasped. Grant said, "You cannot remove us from our own event." Caroline's expression did not move. "It is not your event, Grant. It is the hospital's." That correction landed harder than anything else. Vivian had spent years treating charity as a mirror. Caroline reminded her it was supposed to be a window. Vivian turned to the room and realized too many people were watching. Not staring openly. Worse, watching politely. The way wealthy people watch collapse while pretending to admire floral arrangements. She gathered her clutch, lifted her chin, and walked toward the lounge with Grant beside her. Sienna followed, crying silently. Evan stayed behind. The choice hung there between us, visible for the first time. He looked at me and said, "I should have told the truth before tonight." I nodded. Yes. He waited, maybe for comfort, maybe for forgiveness, maybe for me to make the next step easier. I did not. "I need time," I said. He looked down. "I know." The auction continued. Money was raised. The hospital got its donation. BCI's sponsorship was acknowledged correctly. The wine lot sold for more than expected without the Whitmore name attached to it. That was the quietest justice of the night. The cause survived the people who tried to use it. Near the end, Daniel handed me a final printed confirmation. Whitmore dependent access revoked. Account locked. All pending charges frozen. Board review scheduled. I placed it in the folder with the others. Across the ballroom, through the glass doors of the private lounge, I could see Vivian sitting rigidly on a sofa, no longer surrounded by admirers, no longer centered under lights, no longer able to order status and put it on my account. At 9:32 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was Marisol from BCI. "Excellent work preserving the record. Legal will proceed Monday. Do not approve settlement discussions without counsel." I looked at the message, then at Evan standing alone near the terrace doors. 11 months of marriage, and the clearest thing between us was now a compliance file. I felt grief then, sharp and real. But under it was relief. Because love that requires you to ignore the numbers is not love. It is a liability with flowers on top. By Monday morning, the Whitmore name was no longer a password at Ashbourne. It was a question. I knew because Daniel called me at 8:05 before I had even finished my coffee and said the board had opened a formal review of all committee charges connected to Vivian, Grant, and the Whitmore Family Foundation. His voice was professional, but tired in the way people sound after discovering that a polished family has been leaving fingerprints in every drawer. The club had found more than BCI charges. There were unpaid pledges, delayed reimbursements, guest passes assigned to people who were not donors, and private events marked as charity cultivation that looked a lot like birthday parties with better stationery. Marisol called an hour later. BCI Legal had frozen all Ashbourne-related hospitality activity pending review. My name was removed from every dependent access point. A formal notice was sent to Ashbourne, Vivian, Grant, and Evan, preserving records and demanding documentation for personal charges. Marisol did not ask how I felt. That was why I liked her. Effortless me enough not to turn a financial violation into gossip. "You did well," she said. "The only reason this did not become a corporate exposure problem is because you flagged it before the auction charge cleared." I thanked her, then sat very still after the call ended. Before the charge cleared. That was how close they had come to using my career as a costume for their reputation. Evan came home at noon with a suitcase and the face of someone who had rehearsed an apology in the car but lost confidence at the door. He looked around our condo like he was seeing our life after someone had already packed it into evidence boxes. "I'm staying at a hotel for a few days," he said. "I think we both need space." I nodded. "I think so too." He swallowed. "My mother says the club is exaggerating because Caroline has always been jealous of her." I almost smiled. Vivian could fall through a trap door and accuse the floor of envy. Evan looked embarrassed as soon as he said it. "I don't believe that. Not really." I asked. "What do you believe?" He set the suitcase by the door. "I believe I was a coward." The sentence hurt because it was finally clean. No decoration, no family fog. Just the thing itself. "I knew Mom was using the account after the first dinner charge," he said. "I told myself she would reimburse it. Then it kept happening. And every time I thought about telling you, I imagined the fight. Mom crying. Dad calling me ungrateful. Sienna saying I changed after marriage. So I did nothing." He looked at me with red eyes, and doing nothing became helping. I did not rush to soften it. He needed to hear his own truth echo. And I said, "You let them mock me while they used me." Evan closed his eyes. "I know. You let your mother call me cheap while she was spending through my authority." "I know. You asked me not to send the records because you were more afraid of them being exposed than me being harmed." That one made him open his eyes. "I was afraid of losing my family." I nodded. "And I was afraid of losing myself." He had no answer to that. There was no answer that would fix it. Some truths do not create resolution. They just mark the place where pretending ends. That afternoon, Vivian came to the condo uninvited. I knew it was her before she knocked, because the concierge called up and said, "Mrs. Whitmore is insisting she's expected." Expected? Even after everything, she believed the right tone could turn a locked door into an appointment. I told the concierge not to send her up. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. Vivian's name filled the screen, then Grant's, then Sienna's, then an unknown number. I did not answer. At 3:14, Vivian left a voicemail. Her voice was shaking, but not with remorse. "Natalie, you have gone too far. Grant received a notice from the club. They are suspending our membership pending review. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what people will say?" I listened once, then saved it to the same folder as everything else. Not because the voicemail mattered legally, but because I wanted a record of what she chose to mourn. Not the misuse of funds, not the pressure on her son, not the risk to my job, the membership, the whispers, the fear that people would say what was true. That evening, Daniel sent the official board notice. The Whitmore membership was temporarily suspended. Vivian was removed from the charity committee. Grant's charging privileges were revoked. The foundation table was canceled from future donor materials until its pledge status could be verified. Every sentence was polite. Every sentence took something she valued. 2 days later, I met Denise Park, a family law attorney Marisol recommended, in a quiet office downtown. I had not decided whether I wanted a divorce, but I knew I needed information before emotion started negotiating against me. Denise reviewed the account file, my marriage documents, joint expenses, and the condo lease. "You need financial separation immediately," she said. "New accounts, password changes, remove shared access, freeze any cards where he or his family had indirect exposure. And do not let guilt make business decisions for you." I looked down at my hands. He apologized. Denise's expression did not change. Good. An apology can be emotionally meaningful and legally insufficient at the same time. That sentence stayed with me when I went home. Evan was not there. His closet was half empty. On the kitchen counter, he had left his key beside a note. "I'm sorry I made you stand alone in rooms where I should have stood with you. I need to figure out whether I can be a husband without being my mother's son first." I read it twice. Then I folded it and placed it in a drawer, not the evidence folder. The note belonged somewhere else. Not proof, not excuse, just grief. The final collapse came the following Friday at Ashbourne, during what Vivian believed would be her private appeal to the board. Daniel later told me she arrived in a cream suit with Grant beside her and a binder labeled Whitmore Legacy Contributions. She expected a conversation about restoring appearances. Instead, the board had BCI's notice, the billing history, unpaid pledge records, and committee misuse documentation. Caroline Hensley asked one question. Were any of these charges approved in writing by BCI? Vivian tried to talk about years of service, family reputation, hospital children, and misunderstandings. Caroline repeated the question. Grant finally admitted there was no written approval. By 5 o'clock, the decision was official. The Whitmore membership was terminated for misuse of club accounts and misrepresentation of donor status. Vivian's committee roles were permanently revoked. The unpaid foundation pledge was referred to council for collection or public correction. No police lights, no screaming, no dramatic escort down the marble stairs. Just an email with a PDF attached. The kind of ending that people like Vivian feared most, because it could be forwarded. That night, Vivian called me from Grant's phone. I answered once, only because Denise had advised that one clear boundary could be useful. Vivian did not say hello. "You have destroyed us," she said. Her voice was low, stripped of silk. "No," I said. "I removed my name from your bills." She laughed bitterly. "You think you're better than us." "No, I think I am no longer responsible for funding you." There was a pause. Then she said the quiet part at last. "After everything we let you become." I almost felt sorry for her then. Not enough to soften, just enough to understand how deeply she believed proximity to her family was a prize I should pay to keep. "Vivian," I said, "you did not make me valuable. You only found a way to spend near me." Then I ended the call and blocked the number. 3 months later, Ashbourne looked exactly the same from the road. Same white columns, same trimmed hedges, same bronze sign shining at the entrance like nothing ugly had ever happened behind its doors. That was the strange thing about public consequences. Buildings stayed beautiful. Chandeliers still glittered. Servers still carried champagne. New committee names replaced old ones on printed programs, and the world continued with polished efficiency. But inside that sameness, the Whitmores were gone. Their reserved table was gone. Vivian's name no longer appeared on charity stationery. Grant no longer had a locker in the men's lounge. Sienna stopped posting brunch photos from the club. A whole lifestyle had vanished without a single moving truck, because it had never been as solid as they wanted everyone to believe. BCI closed its review after the unauthorized charges were reimbursed through a settlement handled by counsel. I did not attend the meetings. I did not negotiate with Vivian. I did not sit across from Grant while he explained how accounting confusion worked in families with unpaid pledges and wine transfers. Marisol handled the corporate side. Denise handled my personal boundaries. And I did the one thing my younger self would have thought impossible. I let professionals protect what I had built, instead of trying to make abusers understand why they had hurt me. The final settlement was not dramatic. The Whitmores repaid the personal charges tied to BCI. Ashbourne corrected its donor records, and every dependent access point connected to my name was permanently revoked. No applause. No courtroom speech. Just signatures, reimbursements, and closed accounts. Evan and I separated quietly at first. He stayed in a furnished apartment near Midtown, while I kept the condo through the end of the lease. For several weeks, he sent messages that sounded like therapy homework. I understand I failed to protect you. I understand silence was a choice. I understand my mother trained me to confuse loyalty with obedience. I believed him. That was the painful part. I believed he was finally seeing it. But seeing a cage is not the same as walking out of it. Every time Vivian called, he answered. Every time Grant framed consequences as family persecution, Evan listened. Every time Sienna cried that I had ruined everything, he tried to explain both sides to me, as if there were two fair sides to someone using my professional authority without permission. The last conversation we had as husband and wife happened in our condo kitchen, beside a stack of mail and 2 mugs of coffee neither of us drank. Evan said, "I'm trying, Natalie." I said, "I know." He looked relieved too quickly, so I finished the sentence. But I cannot be married to someone whose first instinct is still to manage my reaction instead of stop the harm. His face crumpled. I love you. That one hurt. Because I loved him too. Or at least I loved the version of him that existed when his family was not in the room. But marriage cannot survive as a private island surrounded by public cowardice. I know you do, I said. But love that only defends me after the evidence is printed is not enough. We filed for divorce before our first anniversary. Vivian called it vindictive. Grant called it unnecessary. Sienna posted a quote about people who marry into a family and then try to destroy it. I did not respond. By then, I had learned the freedom of letting people misunderstand me when the truth was already documented. Evan signed the separation agreement without a fight. He cried when he handed me the last box of my things from his apartment, and I cried after he left, sitting on the floor beside a lamp we had bought together on a Sunday when everything still felt possible. Peace does not always arrive smiling. Sometimes it comes after grief has emptied the room. 6 months after the auction, I attended a children's hospital donor luncheon at Ashbourne as BCI's compliance representative. I almost declined, but Marisol said, "You should not have to avoid a room because someone else misused it." So I went. I wore a charcoal dress, simple gold earrings, and the same nude heels Vivian had once made me feel ashamed of. Daniel greeted me at the entrance with professional warmth. Caroline Hensley shook my hand and said, "Good to see you, Mrs. Brooks." Then she corrected herself gently. "Ms. Brooks." I smiled. Natalie is fine. There was no Whitmore table, no emerald silk, no forced family performance, just donors, doctors, and a new committee chair who seemed more interested in hospital equipment than being photographed beside flowers. During lunch, a young pediatric surgeon spoke about the new treatment room funded by that year's auction. She showed a photo of a little boy ringing a brass bell after finishing therapy, his mother crying beside him. The room grew quiet in the right way. Not scandal quiet, meaningful quiet. I thought about the wine display Vivian had tried to attach her name to, the pledge she had not paid, the children's photographs used as scenery for status. Then I looked at the surgeon and realized the final revenge was not Vivian losing a club membership. It was the cause continuing without her name on it. The hospital did not need her performance. The money went where it was supposed to go once the people using it for image were removed. After the luncheon, Daniel handed me an envelope. "This came through the club office," he said. "From Mrs. Whitmore." I almost handed it back. Then I opened it in the parking lot because curiosity is not forgiveness. Inside was a single card with Vivian's perfect handwriting. "Natalie, I hope you are satisfied. We have lost friends, standing, and years of work because you could not show grace." There was no apology, no acknowledgement, no mention of the charges. I read it once, folded it back into the envelope, and dropped it into the trash can beside the valet stand. That was the moment I knew she no longer had any power over me. Not because she was sorry, because I no longer needed her to be. A year later, I started my own compliance consulting practice for small healthcare firms and nonprofits. My first client was a community clinic that needed help separating donor funds from operating expenses. My second was a charity board that wanted stronger controls after a treasurer borrowed money for personal travel. Every time I wrote a policy requiring dual authorization, restricted user access, and documented approvals, I thought about that night at Ashbourne. I thought about Vivian saying receipts were for people who worry. She was wrong. Receipts are for people who refuse to let charm rewrite reality. I kept one thing from that marriage, the BCI folder from the auction night. Not on display, not as a shrine, just in a file cabinet with other closed matters. Sometimes people ask me whether I regret exposing them publicly. The answer is no, because I did not expose them. I asked for the receipts. They exposed themselves. Vivian built a life on borrowed access. Grant protected it with silence. Sienna enjoyed it without questions. Evan saw enough to know better and waited too long to say so. All I did was stop letting my name pay for their performance. The lesson Natalie carried forward was simple. Status without honesty is just debt wearing jewelry. Family does not mean unlimited access to your work, your reputation, or your signature. Love does not require you to look away while people use you. And grace is not the same as permission. If anyone in your life has ever called you difficult for asking where the money went, remember this. The person demanding silence is usually not protecting peace. They are protecting the lie that lets them keep spending.